Hello, and welcome to LAWASIA's webinar on children and young people's human rights in today's world. I am Dr. Holly Doll-McAway, and I am a children's rights academic from the Macquarie University Law School in Sydney. I'm also the LAWASIA Expert Counsellor for Children. To start our meeting today, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the beautiful land I live and I work on, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation. I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I thank the Wallumattagal people for caring for country and for nurturing and teaching children on this land since the dream time. I recognise Aboriginal sovereignty over this land, that this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are currently experiencing a very challenging time for children's rights globally. UNICEF describes the COVID-19 pandemic as the biggest global crisis for children that has rolled back virtually every measure of progress for children, plunging 100 million more children into poverty. Children globally are experiencing so many serious breaches of their human rights. Some of the most pressing children's rights across the Asia-Pacific region are the multi-dimensional impacts of climate change, of poverty, the millions of children who have no access to education or healthcare, child labour, the impact of war and conflict, discrimination, political persecution, and the millions of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people, so many of whom are children and young people. One of the greatest social and legal challenges facing the world today is the persistently high rates of violence against children, including sexual violence, particularly against girls, that is occurring in the home, on the street, online, and in schools. The global community needs to do far more to implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child at the domestic level and to address all of these children's rights abuses. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with three eminent children's rights experts and advocates about some of these challenges and some ways to address these challenges. At the end of this webinar, there will be time for you to ask the panelists questions, so please post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It's my pleasure now to introduce the speakers on the panel today. Firstly, Mikiko Otani is the chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, the body of 18 independent experts who monitor state implementation of the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Ms. Otani is a practicing lawyer who specialises in family law and has extensive experience of NGO activities in international human rights law. Her focus areas include migrant women and children, human trafficking, international child abduction, remedies for victims of human rights violations, access to justice, and human rights education. Ms. Otani is a leading representative in Japan's civil society. She was an alternate representative for Japan to the UN General Assembly and an NGO representative advisor to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Ms. Otani has been actively involved with NGOs and professional organisations at the regional and international levels for many years. Thank you, Mikiko, for being with us here today. Our second speaker is Dr. Rukmini Banerjee, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of Pratham Education Foundation. Sorry, Rukmini, I pronounced your name incorrectly and I apologise for that. The Pratham Education Foundation is an innovative learning organisation established in 1995 to improve the quality of education in India. Pratham began their work with marginalised children in Mumbai, but now their activities have spread to many parts of India and to many other countries. Rukmini was trained as an economist in India and later completed her PhD at the University of Chicago and spent many years living in the USA. She has extensive field experience working with rural and urban communities, as well as in designing and implementing large-scale partnerships with governments for improving learning of school-aged children. Rukmini is the 2021 recipient of the Yiran Prize for Education Development. She writes frequently on education in both Hindi and English, and enjoys writing books and stories for children. Thank you, Rukmini, for being with us here today. Our third speaker is Sharmila Sekaran, and she is a partner at Gerald Gomez and Associates in Malaysia. She studied law in the UK and graduated with an honours degree in law and economics. Ms. Sekaran is a co-founder and founding chairperson of the NGO called Voice of the Children, an advocacy group with a mission to promote law and policy reform to advance children's protection rights in Malaysia. Ms. Sekaran advises on a number of Malaysian government child protection specialist task force, and she speaks locally and internationally on many children's rights issues. Thank you so much, Sharmila, for being with us here today. Now, I would first like to turn to Mikiko, if I may. Mikiko, you are the chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And in your candidature speech for re-election on the committee in 2020, you said these words: "My long engagement with human rights bodies has sharpened my focus on the rights of women, children, and migrants." And you also stated your commitment to focusing on 3 areas: girls, child participation, and access to justice for children. Could you please tell us about why these 3 areas are so significant and about your work in these areas?
Thank you very much, Holly. It's such a pleasure to be on the panelist, to be on the panel today to talk about the young people and children's rights. So very quick, simple answer is that I have been also working for women's rights. And when I come to the children's rights communities, sometimes I see the discrepancy or gap between the women's rights movement and the child rights movement. But for me, if we really want to achieve gender equality, we have to start from the children, and because we cannot just wait for 18 years for the children to become the women and start working for the women's rights. So I believe that for the gender equality, the girls, we need to focus on girls. So that's a very simple answer, why girls. Secondly, child participation. When we talk about the human rights, this is about the human beings who are rights holders. But very often adults talk about the children's rights and work for the children's rights and work with the children. But this is all about children. So we cannot just work without the children. So for me, child participation is such a key principle. Of course, it is recognized as one of the 4 general principles under the convention by the committee, as Article 12 talks about the respect of the views of the children. But it's more than respect of views of the children. We have to have the children at the center. So again, it might sound very simple answer, but because we are working for the children, we have to work with the children, having the children at the center. So this is the child participation in my view. Secondly, access to justice. This is, in my view, so much related to the recognition of the children as rights holder again. Unfortunately, we of course want to prevent the violation of human rights, but in reality, unfortunately, it is happening. So we want to focus on prevention and protection of the rights, but when the rights are violated, providing the remedies to the rights holder, it's necessary to complete the picture in a way. So again, access to justice is one piece of very important element of the whole picture of the human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikiko. I think that that's such a important way of conceptualizing children's rights, and I thank you for those insights. Children's participation is far more than just respecting children's view. It's about integrating those views into the way we conduct civic life. Thank you very much. And remedies indeed need to be part of the international human rights law justice system. I have another question, if I may, Mikiko. Renowned child rights scholar, Professor Laura Lundy, has said recently that it is a cold climate for children's rights globally. Because of your key role within the UN system, you're uniquely placed to comment on the global child rights context, of course. What are the key child rights challenges facing the world today, please?
Thank you very much. We are sensing the backlash or pushback to the child rights at the global level, but also at the regional level in various regions, and also at the national level. Again, I touch upon the gender, mainstreaming gender movement. Of course, there is the backlash against women's rights movement. Unfortunately, I think there is some similarity, but for the children's rights, we even haven't reached the level of child rights mainstreaming. We are still fighting against the conception that children really don't have the rights. Or of course, the Convention on the Rights of the Child recognize the children's rights. However, still globally and at the national level, there is a perception that parents have the rights and children are still minor and vulnerable and immature. Why we are still fighting against such a perception? But in addition to that, we are witnessing the pushback to even something which have achieved after 30 years of the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think there is a misperception about the children's rights because it's conflicting with the parents' rights, or we are creating the very aggressive children who only claim their rights. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, more than 70 years ago, said that every human being has a right and unequal. So though, of course, physically or mentally or in many ways, we acknowledge the vulnerability of the children. However, children are human beings, and I think we are still fighting against that. They also, I would say that today we are talking about the young people's rights and children's rights. These two areas are not competing each other. However, when the United Nations or some countries are focusing more on young people or youth, children in comparison are seen again very vulnerable, very weak, immature group of the human beings compared to the youth. So I think the teenager, like 15 age to below 18, is covered actually under the youth. However, within the youth group, the teenager is somehow marginalized, and the more younger children below 15 do not have enough space at the global level, at the United Nations, in the United Nations setting, and also at the national level. I think these are the real challenge I am seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikiko. I think that is a very key issue when children particularly are, pre-verbal or don't have advanced verbal skills. So often very young children their interests can be entirely left out of civil society and governmental decision making. So thank you so much for highlighting that really key need and requirement under international human rights law to include children in our considerations. If I can move on to another question for you, Mikiko. You have already answered this to some degree, but if you wouldn't mind articulating even further on this point, and I'd like to pick up on some of the other statements that you have made publicly. You have said that any efforts to protect human rights and achieve gender equity begin with children, and you've said that already in this webinar. You said that protecting children's rights can make the entire society more just, more peaceful, more inclusive, and more sustainable. And adding to this, you believe that integrating a child rights perspective will strengthen the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Could you please talk to these two elements of this statement? So first, that protecting human rights starts with children and leads to justice or a more just society. And second, that connection to the SDGs. Thank you, Mikiko.
Thank you very much. When I first learned about the work of the United Nations in the area of human rights, I was so fascinated and inspired about the concept that the human rights and peace are interconnected or supporting each other, and also the development. And later on, I would say gender came in a big way in the UN work. But coming back to the human rights and peace, so we really want to create the peaceful society, and the human rights has such an important role to play to build and sustain the peace. But when I became a lawyer, I realized that I learned law and in the university in Japan, and I realized that we understand the human rights in a very narrow way. I felt, and the lawyer's work is, of course, to provide remedies when the violation happens. However, I felt that we need to practice human rights everywhere in our every life. And by that, we can contribute more to the prevention rather than working afterwards, after the violation happens. So that's the reason why I became interested in the human rights education. And when I started interested in human rights education, it was around 1993 when the World Conference on Human Rights was held in Vienna. And the Vienna Declaration and Program Action highlighted the importance of the human rights education, and the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Decade for Human Rights Education from 1995 to 2005. I myself, as a lawyer, was feeling that the lawyers, the judges, prosecutors, and other professionals who are relevant to the human rights need to be trained specifically. However, everyone needs to be trained about the human rights. And then I thought the children, everyone comes through the childhood for 18 years. And when you become adults, if you are already prejudiced, we have to unlearn. But if we start from the children, from the birth, and 18 years, it's a foundation for everyone. And this group of the human being a foundation for every society. So I felt very strongly, and I continue to feel very strongly, we need to focus on children to teach them about human rights, to create the peaceful society. So the SDG, it's about sustainable development, but it's about a sustainable society, sustainable peace, and we talk like a slogan: no one's behind, and no one is left behind. So my feeling is that why don't we start from the children? Children are more than quarter of the whole global population. And as I said, I will emphasize again, everyone spends the childhood years for 18 years. So we cannot neglect such a critical importance of this group of the people. And when we work together with the children, it's a very firm foundation for the sustainable society, inclusive and sustainable and just society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikiko. I appreciate your responses, and I know the participants in this webinar do too. And I think that you speak to the the relevance of children's rights across whatever sector you're working in and whatever kind of lawyer you are, whether you're in corporate law or human rights law or any other kind of law, contract law, and so many aspects of law, indeed maybe all relate to the rights of humans, and that relates to the rights of children. Children are not mini humans with mini human rights, and I think that that's very much the essence of what you've been sharing with us. Thank you, Mikiko. I have one final question of you, if I may, before I turn to Rukmini and then to Sharmila. And that is about your statement in October 2021 at the General Assembly, where you emphasised the impact of the pandemic on children and the alarming increase in child poverty. And you expressed the committee's deep concern about the adverse effects of climate change on the life trajectory of children. Would you please tell us more about this, including the committee's recent general comments, number 26, on children's rights, the environment and climate change? If you would, just in a couple of minutes, if that's okay. Thank you, Mikiko.
Thank you very much, Holly. You asked earlier about what is the challenge today to the children's rights, and I talked more about the backlash or the pushback we call. But if I may add another challenge, which is the inequality, poverty, you said. We are living in a digital world, but the digital divide, poverty and climate change is actually affecting all the children globally. However, how children are affected, again, there is an inequality. Those children in the country who contributed least to the global warming are actually affected more seriously. So inequality, the poverty or access to education, access to digital, all these inequality is really the key. And the global, many children are feeling about climate change. They are the most seriously affected group of the population because of the previous generation. So again, they are feeling that the children don't use necessarily about the discrimination, but they are feeling that the children are most affected. So it's really the issue for the children, and this is I think this is the background of the increasing children's activism. So the committee is listening to their voice very seriously, and as a monitoring body for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we feel that we have to respond to the children's voice who are seriously talking about the climate justice. So I want to add one more point. When we talk about the inequality, of course, the committee asked the state parties to fight against the discrimination within the country. But all now I described about the digital divide or the different impact of the climate change in the developing countries or developed countries or poverty issues. For those inequality within the countries, the international society has to work in a joint way or in a solidarity. This aspect has not been addressed seriously so far. The Convention on the Rights of the Child talk about the importance of the international cooperation, but still the wealthy countries haven't met their responsibility, shared responsibility to realize the children's rights in every place. Again, I'd like to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the concept, universal rights. Wherever you are born and your rights need to be equally protected. I think now we really need to talk about international cooperation and the responsibilities of all states to work jointly for the realization of the universal human rights, including, of course, children's rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mikiko, for sharing your insights and wealth and depth of experience about children's rights. I'd like to move now to speak with Rukmini. And you are the CEO of the Pratham Education Foundation. And Rukmini, your work and the foundation's work centres on advancing children's rights to education in India. And Pratham means first in Sanskrit, and true to its name, it is the first major organisation to achieve lasting and wide-scale success in India's educational landscape. And this is largely owing to a radically different way of providing education. Could you please tell us about this innovative work and why it is so unique?
I think, Holly, this is the last 30, 40 years for countries like India have been a very major shift in bringing possibilities to whole generations of course, children, and then they grow up. And education plays a major role. So if we want to go ahead with this idea that nobody gets left behind, then I think there are a whole bunch of things you have to do to connect not just more disadvantaged populations with others, but also I think there is a big link that needs to be made between home and school. We have a large number of children in India whose parents themselves did not have much schooling. So while they appreciate what schooling entails, because they've seen what it means to go to school, be in a building, be with a teacher, I think the real challenge that we are also trying to look at is how does schooling and learning move together? Because in the end, the reason that you get education, that you have years of schooling, is all of that needs to translate into some kind of a value add that increases a child's capabilities. So as Pratham, I think, we are about 25 years old. And we believe that as citizens of a country, we are the major funders of our public education system. And therefore strengthening that education system to ensure both universal schooling as well as guaranteeing that every child learns is part of our responsibility as well. And so most of the things that we do, I think, look at this school and community filling the gaps, as well as looking at how our landscape is evolving and how our new challenges coming up that need solutions, not just solutions that can be done inside the school, but firstly, problems that can be understood by everyone, and then solutions that a large number of people can participate in. So they need to be simple and frugal and effective. That's, I think, capturing the essence of what we do.
Yes, it's such innovative work, and I just want to, I guess, sing your praises a little bit more, if I may, Rukmini. Last year, you won the 2021 Yidden Prize for Education Development, and among other things, for pioneering the annual status of education report, known as the Asar Report, that you began in 2005. By way of background for our participants today, the ASER is an annual household-based citizen-led survey of unprecedented scale. It assesses 600,000 children in practically all rural districts in India over 100 days every single year. Many other countries have adopted this assessment method. Now, I think it's irrefutable to say that this is an astonishing educational achievement. Rukmini, can you tell us about this and what some of the key factors are that enabled such great success in implementing children's rights to education in this regard are? Thank you.
So I would say that even in the early 2000s, India was moving quite steadily towards, higher and higher enrollments for children in school. And, as we all know, children who are left out, who are not in school, are very visible. You can see them on the streets, you can see them in the fields. And there is both parents as well as policymakers can work towards getting them into school. More invisible is when you are in school, but not making the progress that is expected from a school system. And I think around 2002 or 3, we were working in many places and we felt this, parents felt it, teachers felt it, that things were not quite what they should be. Yes, the children are in school, but they don't seem to be learning, at the level at which the school system requires if you're going to succeed in the school system. And again, I would say that I keep going back to the fact that we have a lot of parents who didn't have this advantage of being in school, and so often are not familiar with what does it mean to learn well. And so we started doing a bunch of different exercises, which now is called the Asar Report. It stands, as you said, for the Annual Status of Education Report. But in many Indian languages, the acronym Asar means impact. And we felt that it was necessary for a country to understand a new problem. We had been grappling with the idea that all children need to go to school. And once you're in school, the problem is solved, and then we can move on to thinking about other things. But the fact that you could be in school but not learning, even before you come up with solutions, if people understand the problem, I think solutions come naturally. So our effort was, therefore, one, how do you uncover this problem that children are not learning in a way that can lead to productive solutions? So being in the household or being in the community made sense because you can meet all children there. Children who are in public school, children who are in private school, children who are not in school are all to be found at home. Secondly, when you go home, you meet lots of other people. You meet parents, family members, community members, so there can be conversation around this issue. And the third was we actually asked children to do something. There's a very
Excuse me, Rukmini, I believe your connection has just dropped out. Perhaps you might take the video off and continue speaking if that's okay. Rukmini's connection is not going well, everybody. Apologies for that. We will just wait for Rukmini to come back in. But in the meantime, oh, here we go. Rukmini, you're back with us. We lost you for a moment there.
I'm sorry, my internet was holding up very well while Mikiko was speaking. So I had my fingers crossed that it lasts for me as well. Sorry about the break. And so this is what we do, and it is aggregated. So basically it says, can children read basic text, and can children do simple arithmetic? We do the same thing for children all the way up to age 16, because our idea was that you need to go very far, but if you don't have these basic building blocks in place, you can't build a building on it. And so that's what the Asar Report is. And it's been very interesting that different people from different countries have come, have seen what we do, and then taken what is relevant for their own contexts. For a large part of, I would say, the developing world, a lot of the assessment and testing tends to be pen and paper, exam oriented, and quite high level. But children start getting left behind very early. And so if you can't see that at that stage, you cannot come up with solutions. So we feel that exercises like Asar have helped in both uncovering the problem and pushing people towards solutions. And hopefully, this is a problem that we believe can be solved, but it requires widespread acknowledgement and effort.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that wonderful achievement, that ongoing wonderful achievement and long-term achievement that has spread to so many other nations now too. Rukmini, I'd like to ask you now about the impact of the pandemic on education in India, please. In the last 2 years, we've seen lockdowns and homeschooling, and we've seen probably the most significant and unprecedented disruption to children's education globally. What has been the impact of this on children in India, and what has been learnt because of this in terms of children's right to education?
So I think that, India shares some of the common learnings with everybody else, although we've had probably some of the longest school closures. And I know there are many lawyers who are listening in and participating. And I think this is something for maybe another debate. But what can ordinary people do to open schools as soon as possible? We have so many laws that regulate what can happen and what can not happen. And often the education people have to wait for disaster management, for health, and for lots of other ministries to make up their mind. But in terms of what we've seen on the ground, I think the losses and the difficulties are widely known. I thought I would like to focus, Holly, on what we've learned, because I think this period has also been a very fertile time for many reasons. And there are
agree, Rukmini, that is a wonderful focus, what you have learned as a result of the pandemic. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Rukmini is struggling with her internet connection. She's traveling at the moment, so I'm sure she'll be back with us in just a second. And if not, Shamila, we may turn to some questions of you, if that's all right. Shamila, I'd like to talk with you about your child rights work, and hopefully Rukmini will be back with us. Rukmini,
I'm
are
so
you
sorry
there?
about this.
No, that's
Yes,
fine.
I'm
That's fine. These
I'm actually traveling, and I thought it would be anyway. So I would say that these are things that I think we share a lot of common. But during the pandemic, both our own work on the ground as well as some of the Asar work that we did really focused on the role that parents have played. And the way we look at it in India, parents have always been very supportive of schooling, but with schools shut, and particularly in families where digital connectivity was an issue, where you couldn't really access online stuff, I think parents across all education groups have really engaged or tried to engage with what children are learning and how that can. So in a very peculiar way, I think this moving from schooling to learning, perhaps the pandemic will have accelerated the acknowledgement that we need to bring these two things together. I also think that a lot of decentralized, we are a very centralized education system, but because schools were closed, the initiative of teachers, especially teachers who wanted to reach out, I think a lot of that has happened. We are both centralized and we have a very tight, rigid curriculum. And it's hard during a normal time to deviate from that. Even if your children need something else, as a public school teacher, you have to follow what is the. So I think that we saw a lot of creativity and a lot of initiative. The biggest thing, and perhaps Holly, I can just take 2 more minutes. We could not help the closures due to COVID. Perhaps schools could have opened earlier. That is always the case. But I think what we do after schools open is really going to set the stage for what happens to children afterwards. There was a study done in Pakistan some years ago after the Pakistan earthquake, where they looked at the effect of the earthquake on children and on livelihoods and on many things. What they found is that for several years after the earthquake, the livelihood indicators, the health indicators all came back to pre-earthquake levels, but children's learning levels did not. And the authors of that study actually blame what happened after schools opened much more than what happened when the schools were closed. And so in that context, I think we really need to think, at least in India, we see that kids are now in 5th grade. But prior to, they've actually were in 3rd grade before, and they've just jumped to 5th grade after 2 years. And in 3rd grade, our learning levels were quite low. So they were not at 3rd grade level. Many were at 1st grade level. So giving them a 5th grade textbook and curriculum right now is absolutely the wrong thing to do. We need to start where the children are and build up from there. So this is something I would say is a common factor across a lot of the developing world, which had long school closures, rigid curricula, which are often even pre-COVID much higher than the level of the children. And so if we look at this context carefully, this may be the time to bring in reform, to bring curricular levels closer to the levels of children and help in really promoting this learning for all.
Thank you so much, Rukmini, for sharing those insights and some of the positive implications that has come out of this, broadly devastating pandemic, and that beautiful connection you shared between teachers and students, and the flexibility that had to be brought into the education system, and that lovely connection that parents had during lockdowns with many of their children. And I appreciate that was very difficult for so many parents, and very difficult juggling work and homeschooling. So I know that is a varied experience across the board, but I really appreciate you sharing that. Could I ask you a little bit more in the time that we have, Rukmini, about other rights? So we know that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most comprehensive statement of children's human rights, and education links to all the other rights in the convention, such as the right to protection, participation, healthcare, and many, many others. From your experience, Rukmini, what are the key children's rights challenges in India that operate as obstacles to children's education that are contained in the broader body of the convention?
I think before I answer that one, I also think that in this return to school after COVID, a lot more attention is being paid to mental health. I think in our school systems, we didn't think about these things. We thought this is something outside that needs to be considered. We are thinking a lot about safe spaces in many different ways. We are thinking about inequality, I feel, perhaps a little bit more deeply than we should in a society which is quite unequal. I think the digital divide, sometimes I get irritated by the word, but sometimes I think it's a very useful lever, because that digital divide is sitting right on top of every other kind of divide that we already have. But maybe because there's a new spotlight on it, we can deal with those inequalities in a different way. So that's just to continue from your last question. I think there are many challenges in India. We have all kinds of laws. One of the biggest challenges is in translating the laws into practice. And really going again back to what Mikiko said, I think larger awareness about what these rights are, how they can be translated into practice. We have a compulsory and free education law for children up to age 14. And then we have a variety of laws, and you're many lawyers on this call, so I won't pretend I know all the laws of India. But I know that if to work in the organized sector in India, you have to be 18. So there is a 14 to 18, which for us is probably almost 100 or 100.
We're not having good luck with Rukmini's connection. So I will turn to you now, Sharmila, and talk with you about your child rights work. You're the founder and founding chairperson of the Malaysian NGO Voice of the Children, and your work centres on children's participation and children's right to freedom from abuse, violence and exploitation. Would you share with us your work in this regard, please?
20 million.
Yeah, thank you for that, Holly. So Voice of the Children was founded about 10 years ago as an advocacy organization, primarily to raise awareness and do advocacy, both in the public sphere as well as in the legal and courtroom sphere, to advocate for law and policy reform with respect to all issues and rights affecting children, all children in Malaysia. So we do a lot of work advocating not just for Malaysian children, but also for children, for example, who are stateless and refugee children who are in Malaysia. And we strive to ensure that every child in Malaysia is protected under the national and international laws and is no longer at risk of violation. We recognize that there were lots of grassroots organizations that were doing excellent field work, grassroots work, caring for children, trying to protect them through homes and care centers. But what they were not able to do was to scale up and proceed with law reform and advocacy on a larger scale, which would then generate perhaps more lasting improvements in regards to children's lives. And without the large scale kind of law reforms, children's lives and protection will not be fully achieved. So what we try to do at VOC is we bridge the gap by both collaborating with children and young people, as well as with other children organizations, to raise public awareness on these issues. And we try to engage with children from targeted communities. So whether it's stateless and undocumented children or the refugee communities, but also, for example, the urban and rural poor who have different issues affecting them. To try and understand the issues and to then enable ourselves to advocate from their perspective, but also to encourage these children to advocate for themselves, and we guide them along that process. So we also do a fair bit of training and consultation with the government and other legal stakeholders, such as magistrates, judges, basically to impart child rights to them. Totally agree with what Mikiko said just now, that, you know, very often, although we think people know and understand children's rights, it's an issue unto itself. And really there needs to be a lot more training and awareness in this regard. So that's something that we do take on. And have conducted a fair bit of a number of training sessions for magistrates and in particular lower court judges, who are the people who come into contact with children through the juvenile justice system, so that we can then ensure that the welfare of children and their protection is adhered to. So underpinning all our efforts is the understanding that welfare and protection of children in Malaysia can only be realized through the adoption, implementation, and enforcement of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So we try to bring that into the fore in the work we do.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. Your work is so comprehensive, and I think that when you take a children's voice perspective, that necessitates such a comprehensive approach to the work that has really shone through in what you've just shared with us just now. So thank you, Sharmila. Apologies, Rukmini, I will come back to you after I speak with Sharmila, because the insights you were sharing have enlivened the chat. You'll be able to see, and people are thanking you for your contributions. Sharmila, in 2019, I believe it was, Voice of Children made a documentary about child marriage in Malaysia, and that documentary was called Stolen Futures, where you spoke with some children who had experienced child marriage. And you've also spoken elsewhere about the hidden problem of child marriage and the likelihood that there are many more child marriages that have taken place informally in Malaysia. Can you talk about your work to end child marriage in Malaysia, including the socio-legal context for child marriage in your jurisdiction, please?
Sure. You know, and child marriage, we've seen a growth or the rising numbers of child marriage since the pandemic as well. So, you know, this is really, really current in terms of an issue. But for a start, what must be understood is that there are different laws governing child marriage for the different communities in Malaysia. So we have for non-Muslim marriages, those are governed under the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act of 1976. Muslim marriages are governed by the Islamic family law enactments, which are, so for each state, there's a different family law enactment for each of the states in Malaysia. And each state legislative assembly enacts its own laws. There is a kind of template that they utilize, but within that, there is a variation. And then the Aboriginal communities, the first people of Malaysia, their marriages are governed by their own cultural norms and traditions. So really addressing child marriage in Malaysia needs to be addressed from these different perspectives and requires different kinds of strategies. So under the Law Reform Act for non-Muslims, the law basically states that or prohibits any male from marrying below the age of 18. A female may be married below the age of 18, but needs to be above the age of 16. And for those girls, they need to obtain permission from the chief minister of the state that they live in, or that the marriage is going to take place in. However, Muslim marriages, while the laws generally, and like I said, there are different enactments, but in general, the law requires the male to be above the age of 18 and a female above the age of 16. However, they can apply to the Sharia court, the Muslim court, the Sharia court, to get permission to be married below both of these ages, either age for the gender. And there is no stipulated minimum age. So basically, and this is what we're seeing a lot of, girls who've reached the age of puberty can apply to the Sharia court, and the judge can give permission for a girl who has reached the age of puberty at the age of 9, 10, 12 to be married because the law does not stipulate a minimum age. Now, while we expect both the chief minister and the Sharia court judge to act in the best interest of a child, it rarely happens. And rarely do we see them actually undergoing some kind of consideration, deliberation, before giving permission. So it seems to be almost a rubber stamping of an application or request to be married. So what we have found really in this process, in the work we've done, is that there are 5 core drivers for child marriage, and poverty or the socioeconomic status being one of the key drivers. Some of the others are lack of awareness, lack of knowledge and education in terms of sexual reproductive health, as well as, and related to that are poor parenting skills or lack of complete parenting skills, lack of education, poor school attendance, high rates of dropout, social norms and stigma related to particularly child and teenage pregnancies. And added to that is the fact that the laws do not prohibit child marriage. And so, it perhaps provides a pathway to child marriage. So in terms of the work we've done and interviewing a lot of the children to get their views, what we do see is that there's a definite correlation between the core drivers of child marriage. And it is clear that one of the key drivers is poverty or having low household socioeconomic status. And while both male and female children may be impacted, it certainly affects female children a lot more. One of the unique things about Malaysia that we found, and when we've compared our statistics in child marriage to many other nations, particularly, for example, South Asia and Africa, and also South America, is that we have an almost equal number of male and female children getting married, almost equal, although the female children, there are a lot more, which does suggest 2 things. One, again, poverty being a key driver, but also the whole kind of social norms and stigma where children, well, they fall in love, and the obvious response to stopping a child from having an early pregnancy is to get her married. And very often it's to someone of similar age. And that seems to be one of the responses. But closely linked with all this is the fact that, in terms of poverty, is the fact that in many families, parents see marriage as being the only response or the only way out, a viable pathway where there is lack of access to schooling or lack of opportunities for continued schooling. And associated with this is also the quality of education. So it was really interesting to hear the work that Rukmi was actually sharing just now, because the quality of education is really important in terms of being able to keep children in school, keeping children engaged in school and wanting to stay on. And we do see that even children who come from poorer backgrounds, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, where teachers are more engaged and are willing to engage with the children and actually do work outside the formal school system with the child, we see those children staying in school a lot more than the children where there is high rates of teacher absenteeism or where there's a poor quality of teaching, which leads to disinterested students and parents who basically do not think that there's a need for children to go to school. What we have seen actually also is in these areas where there is high rates of poverty, where there is high rates of teacher absenteeism, and where there is lack of quality of education in those states and within areas of those states, there are higher rates of child marriage. Also in terms of disparity, so one factor is where children fall in love with each other, and one of the responses is to get them married, and that comes back to social norms. But what we also see is high rates of where the age gap between the child, in particular a girl child, the female child, and the adult, the person that she does marry, is wide. Again, that relates to the socioeconomic status. So I hope
Camilla, you've answered the question so comprehensively, and I think that the one thing that is so apparent in relationship to what you're saying is the drivers of child marriage, and I'm wondering whether those drivers might drive other risks for children's rights abrogations, such as when children come into contact or conflict with the law. I know with the rise of control orders and restrictions on children and young people's and everybody's movements in many jurisdictions during COVID, that this has led to many more children becoming in contact with the law or indeed in conflict with the law. And I know that Voice of the Children have identified a range of reforms that are necessary in Malaysia. And I wonder whether you could speak to that too, in terms of what you've already shared regarding the drivers of children coming into contact with the juvenile justice system and some of the reforms that are required in Malaysia. Thank you, Shamila.
Sure, one of the key issues here is also lack of agency, where children are not allowed to have control or independence of themselves. And, it's exactly what both Mikiko and Rukmini have said about children being perceived as extensions of adults or less than human just because they're smaller human beings, and as Mikiko rightly pointed out, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all nations are basically have to subscribe to by being members of the UN, does insist that everyone has human rights, and this does include children. It's something that we need to do a lot more work in regard of, to give greater agency and awareness to the fact that children do have rights and must be allowed to protect their own rights and have their rights protected by the adults and other people who engage with them. But in terms of children in conflict with the law, you're right. I mean, a lot of the children that we see coming through the legal system, the juvenile justice system, are children who come from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Invariably, children who do come through the juvenile justice system, who come from families with some means. Generally, the parents do take an interest. They do engage lawyers, and the child is protected within the system in that regard. But a lot of the children who are impoverished, and certainly the movement control orders that we saw, in the early stages of the pandemic and moving onward, we saw a lot of children actually coming into the legal system, into the juvenile justice system, completely unrepresented. Insufficient work because of the movement control orders was being conducted in terms of their the background checks that need to be done before the child comes to court by the social welfare officers. They were not able to either reach the spaces or they were impeded through other means. And hence children were coming to court. We saw situations where children were shackled and handcuffed to adults and brought into court, being kind of shackled and not being taken to a separate courtroom for children, which our system does require. So, there were a lot of violations to these children's rights, which run contrary even to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And in this regard, what we have then found out generally, but also specifically during the pandemic, is that there needs to be a lot more work done, but with regards to all stakeholders of the juvenile justice system. And this means it's the police who arrest the child, it's the prosecutor who brings the charges against the child, it's the welfare department, who actually who are the child protectors and need to be a lot more involved and a lot more engaged in terms of ensuring the child is protected through the system. It's also the magistrates and the low court judges who the child appears before. Malaysia has an adversarial system, I think like a lot of other Commonwealth countries. Ours is an adversarial system, which generally means that the judge or the magistrate sits as the arbiter of justice and watches the two parties, the defense counsel and the prosecutor slug it out and then decides who's right and which way they want to decide. The training that we do suggests and guides the magistrates to being a lot more involved, to being a little bit more inquisitorial, because they have a role in protecting the child as well within the juvenile justice system. What we also find very often is that defense counsel are not adequately trained in the rights of the child. So when we conduct training, we also, one of the core components and one of the early core components of the training is on the developmental stages of a child. So we take the magistrates and judges through the brain of a child to show them that if a child comes from an impoverished background or a dysfunctional background, a background where there's very little communication and nurturing from the guardian or the parent, then the child's brain is underdeveloped. And that results in a child that is more prone to entering the juvenile justice system, more prone to risky behavior, more prone to addiction and behaviors that are addictive, you know, or cause addiction, more prone to not fully understanding right from wrong. So we expect an 11-year-old, for example, to know right from wrong. But if a child has not really been nurtured and has not gone through the right kind of growth process, nurturing process from the age of 2 and onwards, and you know, up to 5 are the key ages, 0 to 5 are the key ages of child development. You know, that's when the brain actually works very, very actively, and you have the growth spurts. You know, the child grows exponentially during those ages. So if we don't understand that, then we're going to treat every 11-year-old the same. But not every 11-year-old is the same. And it goes again to what Rukmini was sharing just now about, you know, tailoring the education system for a child and the needs of that specific child or that group of children, really. So these are some of the things that we guide the court and some of the training that we conduct, both as well, both for the magistrates and lower court judges, as well as for lawyers who are interested in getting involved in the juvenile justice process. One of the key issues that we also found through a study that we did on legal literacy was that a lot of the children do not understand why they were in court, which means if a child has done wrong and they are being brought before the court and being penalized and being sanctioned by the court, they go through an entire process not realizing that they've done wrong, not knowing what the wrong that they did was, which means that we are actually pushing them through a process, which when they leave, they're just going to reoffend and they're going to become greater offenders. We also realized that a lot of the children sometimes were wrongly charged. So we had cases that we spoke to children and we asked them, why were you charged and what wrong did you do? And basically they either say they don't know, or they say, well, it wasn't me, it was the person I was with. But because the judges and the defense counsel and the prosecutors did not do their part in ensuring the child was protected, they just believed the police, they pushed the child through the system. The child spent 3 years in a juvenile detention center, released, but the actual perpetrator or the actual wrongdoer has not been charged, has not known that what they did was wrong. You've got the wrong person who's gone through a system and is you know, impoverished in terms of education, in terms of moving forward in life because of this. So, you know, there's a lot more that needs to be done here in Malaysia, and I suspect in many other countries. And I think lawyers and legal professionals have a great part to play and can do a lot more.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Sharmila, for sharing such rich information about some of the challenges in the Malaysian legal system with respect to children and young people. It's making me think of just a few of our own very serious challenges in Australia, and that being the age of criminal responsibility being 10 in Australia, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child, Mikiko, of course, as you know, have urged Australia to raise the age from 10 to 14, ideally 16, many times in the concluding observations for Australia. And whilst there's some positive signs that our age of criminal responsibility will increase soon, there's also some negative signs that it will not. But it leads to exactly what you are talking about, Sharmila, systemic abuse of young children who are not even aware of the supposed crime for which they are responsible. So thank you, Sharmila, for sharing that very valuable information and those insights into the context for children's rights in Malaysia.
Sorry, sorry, Holly, if I can also just speak a little bit about children coming into contact with the law, because very often, and again with the pandemic, what is not being done enough is to protect children who come into contact with the law. And invariably, these are children who are either victims of domestic violence or some other kind of bullying and violence, or they're children who are involved or come to contact with the law because of divorce proceeding, because of separation of parents, and the impact that that has on the child. We know that very often parents use the child as a pawn in the divorce proceedings. And one of the problems also with child participation is that if judges are not adequately trained to handle this, very often they bring the child in and ask the child who they want to live with. And now what you're doing is you're making a child choose between two parents whom technically they love and whose blood flows through their body, right? We're asking a child to choose between parents, something which really is going to be impossible for a child to do, because we do see that especially in the younger children, even if they have been violated or abused by a parent, they still go back to love that parent. It's something which is very hard to understand, but because it is our parent, very often we do find that there is this pull. And making a child choose, especially at a young age, but at any age between two parents, really may not be the best thing. There must be other ways that we address this issue in terms of determining where a child stays, how much access a parent gets if the child is not staying with a parent, and basically how we deal with children within a custody dispute. So that's part of the work that we're also doing, but really that a lot more work needs to be done in terms of that. And what we did see with the pandemic was that very often children were left with one parent, and because of the movement control orders, they were not able to have access to the other parent, simply because they were not allowed to travel between states or outside a specified region. And again, the impact on the child because of that. So again, this is something that governments need to take pay attention to, as well as the other actors, the legal actors within the system.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'd like to press on because I did promise participants that we would have the opportunity to ask our panelists questions, and our time is flying by very quickly. By way of a final question to our panelists, I'd like to suggest that the panelists give the participants in this webinar some advice. And most of the participants in today's webinar are from the legal profession. And to finish our panel today, I'd like to ask you to share your advice or some suggestions about the vital role lawyers can play in the advancement of children's rights in their respective jurisdictions. Mikiko, could I please go to you first? How do you believe lawyers can play a role in advancing children's rights?
Thank you very much. I want to pick up something which Shamila raised, that the magistrates are not necessarily trained. And I think this is also true for lawyers. And my area of practice is family law. And of course, we lawyers have opportunities to directly talk with the children, but we are not actually not trained how to speak with the children. And it's very strange because, as I said, that we were at some point we were children, but when we become the adults, we somehow lack the sensitivities, how children feel, and what is the proper way to speak with the children in child-friendly way, and not judge what they say, or not ask the children in a direct way, for example. And we are not trained about the development of the children. So if you as a lawyer or the judges or prosecutors who deal with children directly, of course, we need to learn more, not just about the law juvenile law or the family law, but beyond that, we need to understand the development of children and how to deal with the children. But if you are not in those areas who deal with the children directly, still you have many laws to play. For example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child talk about the parental responsibility, shared parental responsibility, which is under Article 18 of the Convention. So, this relates to what the companies have the policy about the child leave or the leave for the parents who have children. So if you are in-house lawyers, you have a lot of role to play to give the advice to the company. If you are a commercial lawyer and if you have a client who produce the products which are related to the children's safety or environment or the many ways you have somehow contact with the children's rights in many ways. Finally, as just a person in a family, if you become a parent, you have a lot of very important law as just a family member. In your family as a parent, from the very beginning of the children's life, or even if you are grandparents already, then you also have a law or in community, or because when we want to protect the children's rights, all adults actually need to be involved. So that's my message to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mikiko. And I think we should never forget the many roles that all of us play in terms of children's lives and the advancement of children's rights in all aspects of their lives. Thank you, Mikiko. Could I turn to you, Rukmini, and ask you a similar question, and perhaps maybe just go back to the question that we were talking about before. And that question is, what advice would you offer lawyers as an educator? What advice would you offer lawyers with respect to their role in advancing children's rights? And I wonder whether you might be able to capture some of what I asked you before around that connection between the comprehensive body of children's rights and education in your answer, if you can. But please feel free to answer this however you wish. Thank you, Rukmini.
So I'm not sure I have a suggestion, but I do have a question. Laws in India, and I am completely clueless about laws anywhere else, and even in India, I only know very few, are written in a way that are very opaque. I mean, you almost need to have a whole other vocabulary and grammar to be able to understand the implications or the core of what the law says. And so I've always wondered, whose responsibility is it if a law has to become a very real thing in practice? Whose responsibility is it to make everybody understand what the law is and what the implications are for you and how in your daily life this plays out? So I do think there is a big scope, and I think that's what, Sharmila has been talking about the work she does, and Mikiko as well. But with the right to education law in India, we did a whole bunch of just reading the law and discussing it. And we used to have an assignment, which we did with all different kinds of people, which said, can you put on one piece of paper, no sentence can be more than, no section can be more than 2 sentences in simple words as to what, according to you, is the core of what this law says. And also add to that, what can you do? You know, what the government should do, what the court should do, what advisory groups should do, those are all laid out. But what about me? I'm a citizen of a country. I want my country to get better. I see that there is a law that needs to be translated into practice. So what can I do? And I feel there's very little talk of this kind outside of specific trainings and so on. So as part of our own school syllabus, let's say that if you are 18 years old, you're in 12th grade, you're going to finish school. What do you know about the law that affects children who are younger than you? And what has been your role in it? So I think that, to to the lawyers and others who are listening, help us who are not lawyers to figure out how we can take this forward, because there is no point in having a law if it is not actually seen in practice.
Definitely. Thank you very much for that important insight. So much more work to be done in terms of child-friendly lawmaking, and then making laws understandable by children and by young people and by the population at large. It's a very largely alienating area, and such an important area too. Thank you, Rukmini. Shamila, would you mind sharing your insights about what opportunities there are for lawyers to play a vital role in children's rights implementation? We know that you're doing an incredible job of advancing children's rights in Malaysia. But if you were to speak to the people on this call who may not be engaged as much as you are in child rights implementation and advocacy, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks for that, Holly. So I have to say that, my background in law actually is from the commercial side. I practice in the area of intellectual property and do a lot of work, commercial work as well. And, in my private life, I also sit on the board of 2 public listed companies. So I'm very much involved in the corporate world in my professional life. But I've also always been involved in human rights, and I've been a human rights generalist. But one of the things I found out in veering towards children's rights, and one of the key reasons why I went into children's rights, I'd never actually practiced in any kind of like singular rights, whether it's women's rights or environmental rights. But, the thing that kind of attracted me to children's rights was exactly what Mikako said earlier. And that is the impact we can make on all of society if we educate and give our children their rights. And when we start understanding and giving children rights, there will be a lot more rights given out to the rest of society and all of community and the world, really. So, so that was my pathway. But, one of the things I would like to say to lawyers is the need to therefore, if you're interested, to go and understand, read up, understand. I mean, I'm sure in any country there are trainings. If not, please reach out to us, and we will try Voice of the Children or to me, and we will try and put you in touch with a similar training arm in your own country. And I'm sure LAWASIA could assist in this as well. But be trained, understand the issues, because a lot of times I hear things like, oh, I'm a parent and therefore I know and understand children, and that's wrong. You may know and understand your child or your children, but you cannot say you know and understand children across the board. The other thing also is the fact that we need to also separate or be prepared to separate a personal view with what the rights of the child is. So, I give the example of corporal punishment. As a parent or from a personal perspective, one may support corporal punishment. We need to spare the rod, you spare the rod and you spoil the child. But there is what is right and best for children per se, and advocating for children per se. And that may be different from a personal view. And we must be able to do that. And lawyers are really well placed to do this because we always argue on the side of our client and not necessarily what we think and believe. So lawyers are very well placed to do this. And that's a skill really that lawyers are able to bring to the table in terms of raising awareness and protecting children's rights. But, like Mikako also pointed out, it doesn't matter which area of law we practice, whether you're in the family law area or criminal law and justice area of law or commercial law, because the rights of children intersect all areas. If you're drafting agreements or vetting agreements as a commercial lawyer and a corporate lawyer, then ensuring that children's rights are protected within that is important. If you're a family law lawyer, then knowing and understanding the impact of your advocacy in court on the child of the family is important. If you're a criminal lawyer, understanding the juvenile justice issues and how they impact on the child can also be brought to bear. So lawyers actually participate in every aspect of society, both in their personal lives as well as the public lives. And being prepared to educate our clients as well as ourselves is part of what we can and should do in terms of protecting children's rights. One of the big growth areas, I must say also, in terms of commercial practice, is business and human rights. And children's rights does form a huge part of human rights. So again, knowing and understanding and advocating to our clients actually enhances the work that we do for our commercial clients.
Thank you, Sharmila. And thank you, Mikiko and Rukmini, as well, for sharing your valuable insights about children's rights in today's world in this webinar. The time has gone so fast, and we have a little bit of time left for some questions. And so I'm going to pose some of those questions to our panelists now. The first question I'd like to ask Mikiko to answer, if you would. A participant from Papua New Guinea asks about the tension between children's rights and cultural norms in society. And this is something that comes up a lot in the children's rights sector, and how to balance that, and whether there should even be a balancing act that occurs between the CRC and its provisions and cultural norms. Would you mind talking to that, please, Mikiko?
Thank you very much. I see such tension even in Japan, and it's not an easy question to answer, but very important question, because if we, just to enforce the international human rights norms or standards without understanding the culture or tradition in the country or in the local community, it doesn't work, because we actually need to involve all people in the society. So it's not just from top down and involving everyone. So it may not easy, but talking with the people and how to, make the understanding of the children's rights, which is not necessarily conflicting with the traditional values. But for example, corporal punishment, we often hear that this is how the parents, this is the way how parents show the love or educate the children. However, we believe and evidence shows that it's harmful to the children. So it may take time, but for me, the dialogue with the community and involving the community, parents, schools, and the children themselves would be the best way to go. I'm not sure if I answered well enough, but I hope so.
I believe you have, Mikiko, and I think that that is the key that filters through all of international human rights law literature, is the importance of making the provisions of international human rights law, in this case child rights law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, relevant to that particular country. And there's many ways we can do that at law and in legislation and through society's own learning about the importance of those provisions, which will be different in different jurisdictions, but nevertheless fundamentally the same. Thank you, Mikiko. There is another question in the chat, and Sharmila, could I ask you to turn your mind to this question? And that question is that line between child protection and child participation. And the questioner has asked about the context in India, and Rukmini, maybe this would be also a question for yourself to answer. In India, the questioner says, we have made laws that make all sexual activity with a person under 18 a criminal offence. However, adolescents engage in sexual activity for various reasons and by choice. And some are also married, as what in terms of what you've already shared, Sharmila, underage by their own choice, but end up being criminalised. I wonder, Sharmila, would you talk to that concept and that idea and the reality of child protection and child participation? And then Rukmini, if you wouldn't mind talking to the latter portion of that question with regards to activities of young people being criminalised, if you would. Thank you, Shamila.
Yeah, thank you for the question. One of the struggles that we have in Malaysia, being a very patriarchal society, is to give children a meaningful avenue to participate in issues that affect them. Very often, where there is child participation, it is a checkbox, manner of participation, rather than meaningful engagement and kind of, extracting what the child really is trying to say and wants to communicate, and utilizing that towards making policy and law reform. There are many people who take the view that, when we engage with children and allow them to participate, then we need to follow exactly what they say. And that is not necessarily true, because sometimes children may not fully understand what they are, the impact of what they want. But it is important to hear them out, to have that conversation with them, and make them understand if we're not following through on what they want, why it is, and how it would affect them and impact them. But then to always, as the Convention of Rights of the Child does, and as our own law affecting children, on the Child Act does, which is to place paramount consideration on the best interest of a child. That must always be at the heart of what we do, the decisions we make, the laws we make, the policies we create involving children. And in terms of child protection, children very often are the best people to tell us when they don't feel safe or when they feel unprotected. And it is important for us to be able to create those avenues and those safe spaces for children to come forward and highlight areas or areas where they do not feel safe, so that we can then make the necessarily changes for their safety and protection.
Thank you, Shamila. Rukmini, did you have any contributions to the second portion of the question with regards to the criminalization of young people and the complexities around that, and the questioner talks particularly about India?
I think my only comment would be that if you take a couple of steps back, one is sex education is not talked about often in schools, or discussed or communicated with children in a very objective, professional manner. Children often pick up these things from friends, from siblings, and even at home, often these are not discussed. So there is a big lack of awareness about what is sexual activity and when and what and how, and the implications. And the second is that, I'm sure if we did a survey of adolescents in India, I bet many will not know the laws that we are talking about. Now, given that these two big deficits or whatever, lack of knowledge, I think it's very difficult to deal with questions like this. You read in the paper about some very, extreme case in which this is being fought out in the courts. But again, as I said earlier, not how it relates to me and my normal life, where none of these things may have happened yet, where I can actually talk about these things in a safe space, where your queries, your concerns, your doubts can actually be, dealt with in a very objective manner. So I think that there's a lot to be done in terms of, keeping up with, not just with the law, but with all the subjects that we are talking about in that law in a broader fashion, so that it's acceptable to talk about these things.
Absolutely. When we stigmatize, we alienate, and particularly alienate children and young people. We have 2 minutes left, and so we don't have any more time for questions, but I think we can all agree that this discussion has been incredibly valuable in not only providing insights into the many child rights challenges across the region, but also in terms of sharing some exceptional examples of how children's rights are being realised in many countries. Thank you, Mikiko, for sharing your wealth of knowledge about the global context surrounding children's rights and the critical role the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child is playing on the global stage. It's so vital. You have inspired us to continue to strive for the realisation of children's rights in our respective domains. Thank you, Rukmini, for sharing your stories of excellence in the advancement of children's educational rights in India and beyond, and how the work of the Pratham Education Foundation is changing the lives of thousands of children in India and in many other countries. It's inspiring to hear about this work and the vast child rights advances you are making. And thank you, Sharmila, for sharing your vital work and how Voice of the Children is playing a key role in advocating for, indeed pushing for, large-scale child rights law reform in Malaysia, and particularly as that relates to child participation, ending child marriage, and increasing children's participation across all domains in civic life. So thank you, Mikiko, Rukmini, and Sharmila for being such powerful agents for positive change for children across the region. In closing, I would like to thank the many people involved in making this webinar possible today. Thank you to the chairs of the LAWASIA Human Rights Committee, Yasushi and Pauline, and the committee members, Firdaus, Shan and Cheyenne, who helped organise this event. Thank you also to the wonderful Shana, Magda and Julie from the LAWASIA Secretariat for their invaluable work that made this event possible. And finally, thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar today. We had over 130 people at one stage, and that translates to many ripples of children's rights advocacy across the region. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the LAWASIA webpage in due course. So thank you and goodbye.